Most people think they know Henry VIII, the overweight king with a thing for chopping off his wives' heads. 6 marriages, 2 executions, and a whole lot of drama. But the truth? It's even darker and more twisted than the gossip. Let's rewind to the beginning. Henry wasn't born to be king. That job was meant for his big brother, Arthur the heir, the golden boy. Henry, he was just the spare. But he was an impressive spare, to be honest. Tall, athletic, charming, could speak multiple languages by the time most kids were still figuring out their shoelaces. He loved hunting, music, jousting, your classic Renaissance prince checklist. Then came the curveball. In 1502, Arthur suddenly died. 'Cause sweating sickness, a terrifying illness that could kill you within hours. No warning, no real treatment, just ... gone. Suddenly, 10-year-old Henry went from second in line to the one wearing the crown someday. As if that wasn't enough. The next year, his mother died during childbirth. Within a year, young Henry lost his brother and his mother and inherited a massive kingdom-shaped weight on his shoulders. You can imagine how that kind of trauma might settle in. And his dad, King Henry VII, not exactly known for emotional warmth, responded by locking the boy down. It's not literally in a prison, but close. He couldn't leave without supervision, couldn't ride, hunt, or even breathe without someone shadowing him. It wasn't protection, it was isolation. For 7 years, 7 years of being watched like a fragile artifact instead of a living, feeling person. By the time he was crowned at 17, Henry wasn't just ready to be king, he was starving for it. Starving for power, for fun, for attention, for everything he'd been denied. His first big move? Marry Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine was a Spanish princess, and also, awkwardly, his late brother's widow. She was older than Henry, politically important, and not exactly part of a fairy tale romance. But hey, royal marriages weren't about romance. They were about alliances, ... and babies. Catherine was no pushover. She was sharp, experienced, and knew how to rule. While Henry was off swinging swords and pretending to be a war hero in France, Catherine stayed home and won a war. Literally, she led England against Scotland, defeated their army, and sent her husband the bloody coat of the dead Scottish king like a twisted little souvenir. Hardcore. But behind the public wins, something heartbreaking was happening in private. Catherine got pregnant again and again. But the babies never survived. Stillbirths, infants who died in days, heartbreaking miscarriages. Only one child made it, Princess Mary, born in 1516, one surviving daughter in over a decade of trying. Now here's where it gets interesting. Henry did father a healthy son, just not with his wife. In 1519, one of his mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, gave birth to a strong, healthy boy, Henry Fitzroy. This proved something dangerous. The problem wasn't Henry, it was Catherine. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't the prettiest girl at court, but she had 2 things far more dangerous: intelligence and confidence. Educated in France, sharp-tongued, religiously opinionated, and when the King of England came sniffing around, she did something no woman had dared before. She said no. She refused to be a mistress. She wanted a crown, not just a spot in the sheets. And Henry, who'd never been denied anything in his life, became absolutely obsessed. For 7 years, Anne kept him at arm's length. She played the long game, waiting for a wedding ring, while watching other women be discarded and forgotten. She understood how power worked and wasn't about to let it slip by. But this chase, it broke something in Henry. Because when the Pope refused to let him divorce Catherine, Henry did the unthinkable. He broke away from the Catholic Church. Just ... walked away from Rome. Started the Church of England. Made himself the boss. Closed down 800 monasteries. Stole their gold. Seized their land. And basically told the Pope to shove it. All for a woman who wouldn't sleep with him. Of course, the price was massive. Anyone who opposed Henry's religious pivot, priests, monks, even his former best friend, Thomas More, ended up dead, beheaded, hanged, or burned. Thousands gone. All because one man didn't like being told no. Eventually, Henry and Anne married in secret. She was already pregnant. The kingdom braced for a male heir. But when the baby arrived in 1533, it was a girl, Elizabeth. And while that little girl would one day become one of the greatest rulers England ever had, Henry didn't see a legacy. He saw failure. Anne had a few more pregnancies, all ended in miscarriages. Suddenly, the woman who'd inspired the most dangerous political shift in Europe couldn't give Henry what he craved most, a son. And then, the magic wore off. The wit and fire that once drew Henry in, now it grated on him. She was outspoken, independent, jealous of his other affairs. She argued with him in public, challenged him in private, basically everything a 16th century queen wasn't supposed to do. And Henry, now pushing middle age and starting to slow down, didn't want a partner. He wanted obedience. Then in 1536, everything changed. Henry decided to joust, yes, joust to prove he was still the chivalrous knight of his youth. But he wasn't. He was 44, heavier, slower, and trying to relive a glory long past. The horse fell. Henry, wearing 100 pounds of armor, slammed into the ground. He was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. Brain trauma? Very likely. But worse was the leg injury. The impact reopened an old jousting wound. This time it didn't heal. It festered. It oozed. It stank. The pain never left. His leg and eventually both legs became permanently ulcerated, infected, and disgusting. The stench followed him everywhere. The pain was constant. And it changed him. Drastically. The Henry who returned to court wasn't the same man. Gone was the charming king who danced and joked in his place, a bitter, paranoid tyrant rotting from the inside and lashing out at everyone around him. And Anne, she was in the blast zone. Anne Boleyn didn't stand a chance. By 1536, Henry's body was broken and his mind unraveling. And in once the woman he tore a country apart to marry had become a target. That year, seemingly out of nowhere, she was arrested and charged with adultery. Not just with one man, with 5, including her own brother. The evidence? Laughable. Most of it was wrung out through torture or made up entirely. Timelines didn't even match. Anne was supposedly in 2 places at once. But logic didn't matter. Henry controlled the courts, and he wanted Anne gone. Within weeks, she was executed at the Tower of London, beheaded with a French sword supposedly as a kindness. She was probably around 35 years old. And here's the part that stings. Just 11 days later, Henry married his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. 11 days. Not even 2 weeks after Anne's death, he was throwing a wedding. And while it's easy to see that as heartless, and it was, Henry wasn't celebrating. Not really. He was in pain, physically, mentally, constantly. Jane Seymour was the opposite of a quiet, obedient, soft-spoken, pale and gentle, everything Anne had never been. But most importantly, she got pregnant, and stayed pregnant. In 1537, after 3 days of agonizing labor, Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, Henry's long-desired male heir. A legal son, born to a queen? After nearly 3 decades of failed pregnancies and dead babies, Henry had finally secured the Tudor line. 12 days later, Jane was dead. Infection took her, as it did so many women who gave birth in that era, and for once, Henry was genuinely heartbroken. Jane had given him everything he'd ever wanted and never asked for more. She was the only wife he chose to be buried beside when his own time came. But of course, Henry couldn't stay single, not for long. England still needed alliances, and his advisors pushed him to remarry, this time for diplomacy, not desire. Enter an oaf, Cleves. She was a German Protestant princess, and Henry agreed to marry her based on a flattering portrait by artist Hans Holbein. But when she arrived in England, disaster. Henry took one look and recoiled. He called her the Mare of Flanders behind her back, and claimed he was so repulsed he couldn't consummate the marriage. Still, politics is politics. The wedding went ahead in January 1540, but 6 months later, it was annulled. To Anne's credit, she took the hint. She agreed to the cancellation, accepted a generous settlement, and lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life as the king's beloved sister. Smart woman. She was the only wife who outlived Henry. But Henry wasn't done yet. Later that same year, he married wife number 5, Catherine Howard. She was about 19. Henry was 49, massively overweight, and stinking from the wounds on his legs. He could barely walk. But Catherine was young, vibrant, flirtatious, and Henry became obsessed. He called her his rose without a thorn. But Catherine had secrets. Before marrying Henry, she'd had relationships not surprising for a teenager living in a noble household with very little oversight. The problem was, she didn't tell Henry. And in a paranoid court where everything got whispered back to the king, secrets had a way of surfacing. When Henry found out in 1541, his reaction was catastrophic. Already in chronic pain and mentally spiraling, he felt betrayed, humiliated, mocked. He convinced himself that everyone, including Catherine, was laughing at him. In 1542, she was executed, barely out of her teens. So terrified, she had to be carried to the chopping block. That made 2 wives dead in 6 years. A clear pattern had emerged. Make Henry angry, and you lose your head. Wife number 6 was different. Catherine Parr was 31, widowed twice, and incredibly smart. She knew exactly what kind of man Henry had become, and she adjusted accordingly. She played her role with precision. She doted on him, helped care for his festering legs, and treated his children like her own. She even managed to reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, no small feat, considering he'd basically disowned both of them at various points. But even Catherine nearly got herself killed. In 1546, her Protestant views landed her in hot water. Conservative members of court tried to turn Henry against her, accusing her of heresy, a charge that, by that point, could get you executed in a heartbeat. Catherine saved herself with clever psychology. She convinced Henry that her religious talk was just a way to distract him from his constant pain. And miraculously, it worked. Henry dropped the charges. She survived. But by then, Henry was barely a person anymore. He was enormous, pushing 400 pounds, and unable to move without mechanical assistance. His legs had to be cauterized regularly to keep the infection at bay. We're talking burned with hot irons. Painful, brutal, medieval torture. The once handsome prince who had dazzled Europe was now a bloated, festering shell of a man. His body was rotting. His mind was warped by paranoia and agony, and the smell. People at court said they could smell him rooms before he arrived. And still he ruled. Every day for over a decade, he lived in agony. And every decision he made, every law, every execution came from that dark place of pain. He couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be calmed. And no one, not even his closest advisors, knew what mood they'd find him in on any given day. He was a king consumed from the inside out, and the worst part, no one could stop him. Henry VIII died in January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. In his final moments, barely able to move or speak, he squeezed Archbishop Cranmer's hand. Maybe it was a plea for forgiveness, maybe just a flicker of humanity trying to break through the fog of pain, paranoia, and blood. We'll never know. But what we do know is what he left behind, and it wasn't peace. Dunnery's reign had begun with so much promise. A golden prince, charming and brilliant, who seemed destined to lead England into a new era. What he left instead was a fractured nation, a mountain of corpses, and a religious system still reeling from his break with Rome. He'd executed around 72,000 people during his reign. Some were political rivals. Some were ordinary people. Many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time or had the wrong opinion. And yet, despite all of this, Henry's legacy endured. Because after his death, all 3 of his children would go on to rule England. First came his son, Edward VI. He was only 9 years old and already sickly. The boy king lasted 6 years before tuberculosis claimed him at age 15. Next came Mary, a daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic who tried to reverse her father's Protestant reforms. Her rule was marked by religious persecution so intense that history would brand her Bloody Mary. She died childless in 1558. And then Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the child Henry had once dismissed as a disappointment. The baby whose birth had pushed Henry further into madness became one of England's most celebrated monarchs. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years. Her era, the Elizabethan age, became a golden chapter in English history. The irony, it's crushing. Henry had destroyed so many lives, burned down institutions, and unleashed terror across a continent, all to avoid being succeeded by a woman. And in the end, it was a woman who would define the legacy of the Tudors. So yes, Henry VIII married 6 times, killed 2 of his wives, broke the world's most powerful church, and left a trail of destruction that England would take generations to recover from. But the most important part of his story might not be the marriages, the wars, or even the church. It was the pain, because everything changed after that jousting accident. The fall that shattered his leg didn't just ruin his body, it broke his mind. Turned a charismatic prince into a monster. The Henry who once composed love songs and danced until sunrise became the Henry who screamed orders from a bed of rot. Pain warped him. And like a wounded animal, he lashed out at everyone who got too close. Lovers, friends, subjects, even his own children. Here's the thing. Henry VIII wasn't born a tyrant. He was made one by trauma, expectation, and unrelenting physical suffering. And that's what makes his story so disturbing. Because it's not just a story of power and cruelty. It's a story about how fragile we really are, even kings. Especially kings, because sometimes even when you have everything, the crown, the castles, the armies, it's still not enough. Sometimes your mind turns against you. And when that happens to someone with unchecked power, everyone pays the price. So was Henry VIII England's worst king? Some say yes, pointing to the executions, the broken families, the chaos left behind. Others say no, that he laid the foundation for a stronger England. That his children's reigns proved his dynasty had lasting strength. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, what happens when absolute power meets absolute pain? We saw it play out in real time. A man torn apart from the inside became the embodiment of tyranny on the outside. His actions weren't just the product of ego or ambition, they were driven by desperation, obsession, fear, and agony. And that's what makes Henry VIII one of the most terrifying rulers in history. Not because he was evil, but because he was human. Brilliant, broken, dangerous. If you've made it this far and want more historical deep dives like this one, make sure you subscribe. Tell me in the comments. Do you think Henry VIII was a villain, or just a man destroyed by pain, power, and paranoia? Let's talk history, and let's keep it human.